He's the lovable all-American sailor, an odd mix of rough-and-tumble mariner, caring gentleman, and universal protector.
I saw my duty and done it.
Born of a depression, tempered by war, he's one of the most enduring and endearing fictional characters ever created.
Popeye was just a working-class sailor who had no mission. He had no agenda other than just to get along.
He was really the first superhero. Super strong and super fast. He beat Superman to the punch by 9 years.
You want to root for the small, scrappy guy who's really there to fight for what's right.
How could you not love Popeye? He's just got a spirit that transcends heroic ideals.
America always needs its heroes, and Popeye is a hero.
Like many legends of old, Popeye's story begins when the world faced the seas of disparate change. After the turn of the 20th century, differing politics and struggles led to the First World War, which in turn reinforced a distinct need for more humorous entertainment, both abroad and on the home front. Newspapers, which at the time were the main source of information, as well as big business, introduced an original American art form, the comic strip. Long before radio, television, and the movies, the comic strips, or funny pages, kept America laughing on a daily basis.
Strips were part of pop culture, and they got talked about on radio, they got adapted into movies. Little Abner and some others were Broadway musicals. I mean, they were a big, big deal.
William Randolph Hearst was very supportive of cartoonists and their strips to help his newspapers, and he built a nice stable of stars. A lot of the early comics that we read today and that were part of the history of comics were developed and encouraged by Hearst.
Popular strips of the time included Crazy Cat and Mutt and Jeff. And while characters' popularity varied, so did the quality of the writing and art. But one thing was certain, newspaper publishers saw big business in the form of these funny pages. There was a demand to be filled, and artists across the country attempted to create the next big sensation. One such artist was a cartoonist named E.C. Segar. Little did Segar realize what he would fall into when his first strip of Thimble Theater appeared in the pages of the Hearst evening papers in December 1919.
The comic strip wasn't Popeye in the first place, it was Thimble Theater, which was a parody of melodramas, movie melodramas.
Segar always wanted to be a cartoonist. That's what he knew. What he wanted to do was his love. After coming up in the field, he was employed by King Features, and he created Thimble Theater in 1919. And the stars of this strip at that time were Olive Oyl, her brother Castor Oyl, and Ham Gravy, and they were the stars. That's who really were pushing the Thimble Theater comic.
He'd been doing Thimble Theater in a rather unsensational way for 10 years, but nothing really happened until Popeye came into it.
The first appearance in January 17, 1929, he was brought on to sail the ship because Ham Gravy and Castor Oyl didn't know how to sail a boat.
So they go down to the wharf and acquire the services of the first scurvy wharf rat they see, who is Popeye.
He was most likely going to be a bit character, you know, a character that kind of walked in and after the storyline was done, he was going to, walk off. But, there was just something about it.
It's not like writing a novel. You don't sit down knowing exactly where this plot's going to go. The day he invented that sailor was a big day for him, and he probably didn't even know it.
He received letters, people kind of dug this character in, and I think Segar knew there was something there with it, and he started writing more around that character.
When Popeye was introduced, he never left, and it just got bigger and bigger, and then really was the Popeye strip.
Here was a comic strip at the height of the Great Depression, in which nobody except the unlikable had money, and the one moral force in this universe was Popeye. I was a fan of Segar's work because he gave this absolutely wonderful comic version of the universe we lived in, almost like a comic documentary.
Segar's world was one of the common people. Born and raised on the banks of the Mississippi River, he needed only the memory of his hometown to find models for the characters and stories he would tell.
Segar was born in Chester, Illinois, and grew up in Chester, Illinois, and most of the characters that show up In the Popeye strip, many of the main characters are based on real people. Popeye himself was based on sort of a local scrapper, a guy named Rocky Fiegel.
Rocky, much like Popeye, was very strong, mangled the English language, and was always thought to do the right thing.
The story goes that a bunch of hoodlums took Rocky out into the woods with the idea of beating him up and robbing him, and apparently he strolled back to town unscathed while they needed medical attention. So when Seagull was looking to create a little tough guy, he had memories of Rocky, and Rocky became Popeye.
As Popeye took center stage in Thimble Theater, its other whimsical characters began to find their way around in relation to the sturdy sailor. Seagar wasted little time in developing the lanky Olive Oyl into the object of Popeye's affection.
Olive was actually based on a school teacher named Dora Pascal, who ran Pascal's General Store for a while as well.
Not the prettiest girl in the comics. I think that's what makes it even more charming, how much Popeye and all her suitors are in love with her.
I think if they made her any prettier and Popeye was her boyfriend, it really wouldn't have worked. And I'm sure Mr. Seagar, when he created them, knew that himself. He was a brilliant guy.
Some characters would eventually get sidelined, while others developed into fan favorites, perhaps because Seagar was adept enough to make them so identifiable. J. Wellington Wimpy was Seagar's tribute to the man who helped start his cartooning career, Bill Schukert, his first boss at the Chester Opera House.
But if you have strong characters, you sort of think of different situations. Like little actors, they take over and lead you along to where you could go with it.
Seagar and his level in those golden years between 29 and 38 was every bit as good as the Marx Brothers at their best and W.C. Fields.
There was no doubting Popeye's impact by the beginning of the 1930s. He was published in newspapers across America, and there was hardly a newspaper reader of the Depression era that didn't know his name. However, even bigger stars were emerging on film. Disney's Mickey Mouse was the gold standard, having graced the movie screen in 1928. In a move that forever changed American culture, King Features made a deal with animation pioneers Max and Dave Fleischer, the creative forces behind the Betty Boop series. The Fleischers saw Popeye's potential as an animated star, but no one could have predicted the unprecedented success that was to come.
The Fleischers in the early days of animation were always scouting around for characters to animate, and one of the sources was looking at, newspapers and comic strips. So he looked at Popeye, and he thought it would translate well into animation.
The Fleischers tried several King Features characters out, but Popeye, the way that Fleischers envisioned him or created him for the screen, really worked.
In 1933, when he made his debut in the Betty Boop cartoon called Popeye The Sailor, the way that feature started with the newspaper announcing that Popeye is a movie star, and that's really pretty much what happened. He became a star, almost overnight, and they started production quickly on follow-up cartoons.
I'm Popeye the Sailor Man. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man. I'm strong to the finish, 'cause I eat my spinach. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man.
Really, it's a Popeye cartoon. Betty Boop has a little cameo appearance in it. And it's the most simple plot that you can think of. Bluto kidnaps Olive Oyl, and Popeye must come to her rescue, and it just introduces us to all the main characters.
The Fleischer Studio got the Popeye format right from the very first cartoon. They set up the triangle between Popeye, Olive, and Bluto that really became the template, the prototype, for everything that followed in 70-odd years of Popeye.
The Fleischers will always be remembered rightly for pioneering all of the technical innovations they did. Three-dimensional backgrounds before Disney, the surrealism in their early cartoons, the first sound on film, all the technical innovations, they were ahead of the game.
There's definitely a different feel to the cartoons. The Fleischers really were focused on, coming off the Betty Boop strips, they were just great at humor. They really just went over the top for that laugh. Welcome to me, Autumn. And I think that's really what sets Popeye's early cartoons apart from other cartoons that were being developed, is they went for the laugh.
I am what I am, and
Whenever the Fleischers needed more characters, they would simply turn to Seagar's strip. Everybody's favorite moocher, Wimpy, debuted in the first full-fledged Popeye cartoon, I Am What I Am. The adorable Sweepy and the gruff Poop Deck Pappy arrived on screen by the late 30s, while Thimble Theater favorites like the quirky Goons and the magical Eugene the Jeep followed in the 40s.
Boy, give me my spinach, I'll show you.
And then there was spinach. The Fleischers saw spinach as more than a green leafy vegetable. It was the ingredient that powered Popeye's strength, as well as the cartoon's energetic finales. Spinach became another important character, and the Fleischers used it far more than Seagar did in Thimble Theater.
In the strip, Seagar did tap into the spinach. He would have things coming and going all the time. So again, like Popeye was really just a walk-on character, and the spinach was used. And when they worked, he ran with them, and that was something that definitely worked, was Popeye and the spinach.
Certainly when the animated cartoons began, you don't have time to do like great big long stories, so they just used a spinach gag constantly.
Can this be the end of Popeye? Is he through? Can't anybody help him? Is there a can of spinach in the house?
Seagar received a fact that in 1934, the consumption of spinach went up by 33% because of Popeye and his eating of spinach. And it's funny because Seagar would start receiving crates of spinach sent to his house, more than anyone could ever eat, you know, just because of his association. And to this day, Popeye's so associated with spinach.
Well, that ends that chapter. Here we are back again. So you'll be strong to the finish if you eat your spinach like Popeye the Sailor Man.
Seagar could not have imagined the larger, younger audience the films brought to Popeye, nor the heat he would get from his powerful boss.
Seagar received orders from William Randolph Hearst to tone down the character once he discovered that there was a huge child following. It was implied that he swore a lot in the speech bubble, so that had to go, and his conduct was entirely ruthless, so that had to change. He had to be a little more human.
Seagar wasn't all that ready to compromise. One of the stories goes, he said there's nothing funny about a sissy sailor.
Seagar, incidentally, only created Pappy as an outlet for all of the nasty characteristics he'd had to remove from Popeye. So really, rather than father and son, it's Jekyll and Hyde. So hence Pappy's existence.
In Popeye's case, he was still getting into fights, but it was all to champion the cause. And I think everyone was happy with that. And really, I think that helped make the character what he was and what he is today.
Popeye's unparalleled success on the big screen was so immediate that even Walt Disney couldn't figure out how to topple him.
Popeye was a bigger draw than Mickey Mouse was, and everybody knows how big Mickey was in the 30s. Quite a top seller. And Popeye actually sold more tickets.
I think the thing people like about Popeye is there's no pretense about the guy, and he's not bothered by things.
Popeye was the anti-hero. Popeye was an old man. He smoked. He had an eye closed from, I assume, fighting. That's why his name is Popeye. This was a gruff character. He didn't speak normal English. He spoke in Popeye-ese.
That's all I can stand, 'cause I can't stand no more.
Popeye was a product of the Depression. He was a product of the early 20th century immigration movement into the United States. And he really did, in that sense, represent the common man.
You can tell a little bit of the Depression era mindset because of where Popeye lives. He never lives in a big, beautiful house or anything. He lives in a little rooming house or a dilapidated apartment building, like in a Dream Walking, for instance.
I told you I'm gonna save her.
A lot of the cartoons are take charge, you know. Don't wait for somebody else to do it. They couldn't afford anything. They had to take charge and do everything themselves. And besides, we can't afford to pay anybody anyway.
But we should have been here by this time.
Well, Popeye is one of the great moral characters in animation. You know, there's not that many of them, frankly. He always wants to do what's right. Sometimes he has to use violence in order to achieve it, but basically he always roots for the underdog. He always tries to see that justice is done, especially, you know, from the hands of bullies. You know, they need to get their comeuppance.
Well, really, Popeye is our modern-day Hercules. If you assume that Hercules and mythological gods like Hercules from the Greeks, the Romans, the Norse, the Egyptians were our first real superheroes, then Popeye was truly the first one in the modern era to make an appearance and to be our version of Hercules.
One could be Freudian and talk about the
the battle between good and evil, and Popeye and Bluto, or the eternal battle for Olive Oil's hand. More than that, it was the cleanness of the animation, and yet the surreal aspect of the way these characters moved and acted and even spoke.
So you won't talk, eh? Goodbye. I am what I am, and that's all what I am.
Popeye's original voice, William Costello, otherwise known as Red Pepper Sam, had a nice, gruff, funny quality to Popeye.
I brought you a Christmas present.
Bill Costello just happened to have that kind of voice. He could do it. There were a few guys running around with that low, raspy voice back then, like one of the bad trees in The Wizard of Oz, like, put that back.
You got to eat spinach if you want strength and vitality. Spinach makes you big and healthy.
What I know about him is he got so full of himself after the first few cartoons that he became impossible to work with.
Well, blow me down.
The task of replacing this rather gravelly voice was not an easy one, and eventually a replacement was found within the Fleischers' own ranks, quite conveniently.
The story goes that Jack Mercer was actually working in the in-between department at Fleischer's, imitating Red Pepper Sam doing Popeye. Dave Fleischer heard him and said, "You," you know? And Red Pepper Sam was out the door, and Jack Mercer was the new Popeye.
At the time, I said I didn't think that I could really do it well enough, so I went home and practiced. And about a week or so later, my voice cracked. And I got this peculiar sound, you know, and I thought, oh my gosh, something happened here. But it was the actual tone that I wanted to get.
Oh, I'm king of the Mardi Gras. What's more, I'm the whole bloomin' show.
But what they didn't know was that they had a real actor there, because he could not only do the voice, he could do the sound, but he could act with it. And he could make the character happy and sad and really get some emotion into it. And that's when I think the character really caught on.
Mercer brought it to another level, adding scat singing, and he did a lot more mumbling under his breath. I don't think Bill Costello really got much into that.
That guy thinks he's big stuff.
But it was because they didn't animate the mouths. They had mouth charts, but they did very little movement with mouths, so you had to kind of mumble under your breath.
Oh, you think you're smart, young fellow? I'll show you. Oh, you want the rascal? Oh, there's one for you. Oh.
But what Jack brought to it was this impish charm to Popeye's ad lib.
How do you like that?
He wasn't just a gruff sailor anymore. He was actually this guy who had some wit going on.
Get a load of this, Toots. Up and over and around.
And his mumblings started to become very, very charming and very funny. And I think that's something that he uniquely brought to the character.
Jack Mercer did the voice for the whole rest of the time, except when he had to serve in World War II. But May Questel substituted for him in a couple of wartime cartoons.
Stop my troubles, 'cause I'm moving today.
Mae Questel was brought in pretty early to do Olive Oil. She was, of course, doing Betty Boop by this time. Completely different voice from Betty Boop, which shows you how versatile Mae Questel was.
Man is big and strong, and oh, dear me, I hope he lets me ride along that.
Olive Oil is hilarious. I know Mae Questel based her on Zazu Pitts, the actress.
I do believe you have a humorous twinkle. Well, keep it up, Connie, and your luck will turn.
It's very, very funny to listen to.
I'm crazy about strong men.
She's very fickle. I think that's something that's very funny about her character. You know, she loves Popeye, but that doesn't stop her from going out on dates with Bluto.
What kind of a joint is this, W?
And what can I do for you, good people?
You can't do anything for me. I want this to become a gentleman, like you.
Oh, well.
There were several early Bluto voices, but the one that stuck was an actor named Gus Wiki. He's that great Bluto voice of the 30s that we all love.
Well, guess I'll dig up a little business around here.
When the Fleischers moved to Miami in the late 30s, I guess Wiki didn't want to come, and he's no longer in any of the cartoons from that point on. And they used various other people to do Bluto, including, I believe, Mercer and Questel. Later on, when the studio moved back to New York City, Jackson Beck became Bluto for the rest of the run.
brawn and no brain. That's me. Now watch me in action.
Jackson Beck's the narrator on Superman, and he was the voice of a generation, really, throughout World War II on radio.
Every little breeze seemed to whisper.
I loved him. I worked with him, and boy, was he something. Mighty lion.
The Fleischers understood the importance of sound to the series' success. They realized that although the talented performances brought the characters to life, a strong theme song could herald a star and remind audiences that Popeye was on his way.
Popeye's theme can be divided into basically two parts. There's the sailor's hornpipe, which is actually an 18th century tune, at least. It can probably be dated back further. It's sort of a sea shanty traditional tune that's been around. Then there's the Popeye the Sailor Man part of the tune, which was written by Sammy Lerner for Popeye's first starring role in Popeye the Sailor.
Though most of the Popeye music was written by Winston Sharples and Sammy Timberg, it was Sammy Lerner who took advantage of a seemingly innocent opportunity.
My father wrote the theme for Betty Boop, and he wrote the theme for Superman. But when the theme to Popeye was to be written, my father had a date. So he got Sammy Lerner to write the theme for him. So he didn't write the theme to Popeye, which is too bad.
He's really one of the only cartoon characters who has his own theme. Carl Stalling at Disney and Warner's didn't like using themes. Scott Bradley at MGM very seldom used themes and phased them out almost altogether by the end of his career. Popeye, on the other hand, we can immediately identify who he is when we hear just a little bit of that music. And so every time he does something that's in his character, that is, eat spinach, we hear his theme. And so it becomes a musical kind of bookmark. We know when he's doing his thing.
The rest of the music was a toe-tapping mix of sunny show tunes and music of the street.
Being located in Manhattan, the Fleischers were really well placed for any popular music that was happening in the 20s and in the 30s, not just because everyone came to New York to perform, but also because the music publishing industry was based in Lower Manhattan, that being Tin Pan Alley.
The music in the Fleischer Popeyes is also very urban sounding, based on the kinds of cartoons they were making with the characters.
You know, the Fleischers were big fans of jazz, and it really reflected that crazy New York feeling of, these musicians and artists that were working in the city at the time.
They would approach these guys, and for the most part, they really loved being involved in the cartoons, providing the tracks and seeing the end result. That was a kick for them.
If we were to say that the Fleischers had a musical legacy, one would definitely be the prominent use of jazz and very contemporary popular music in a way that highlighted how much people liked that music and how fascinating they thought it was.
Because the Fleischers released their cartoons through Paramount, they had free use of the Paramount Music Library, including hit songs that would be introduced in Paramount feature films. So they would take advantage of that. In fact, there are some cartoons like It's the Natural Thing to Do, which is a pretty funny one, that takes its title from the song.
Hey, it's the natural thing to do.
Then they had their own songwriters, their sort of staff songwriters, who came up with these perfect little songs.
Can't go wrong.
Brotherly Love, which is one of my favorites, and I Want to Be a Lifeguard.
Lifeguard with $1 million.
So simple and so straightforward, but they're irresistible.
If I were president, there'd be at least 10 months.
I love the music in those cartoons, especially when they would hire really good songwriters, which they did occasionally, and they're very catchy tunes.
It's hard to put into words the appeal of those songs, but you hear them and you smile.
As they were heading into World War II, the music got more fully orchestrated, more lush, and more patriotic.
I think one of the reasons they used a lot of those tunes is because they're free, and there's nothing better to a production which probably doesn't have that much money than music that isn't going to cost them a lot.
Popeye's acts of heroism were originally confined to tales of gentlemanly duty and honor for his leading lady. That is, until the U.S. entered World War II in 1941. In the mighty Navy, a more patriotic Popeye finally found himself returning to the high seas in an attempt to defend world freedom.
For a sailor, Popeye spends very little time on ships or boats in these cartoons until the 40s with the coming of the war. And that's when they realized they had to put that sailor notion to work. And they had to make the cartoons more relevant to the times.
Cut out the fooling and aim that gun! Aye, aye, sir.
Popeye, he was the sad sack, the private, always having to do all the work and always getting all the blame. So Popeye became the downtrodden, just the ordinary naval seaman, you know, working on board ship, and usually getting everything wrong.
It's a fine way to treat a sailor with my experience.
They didn't want to make fun of war, certainly, but they wanted to show him in action, and they did.
That's all I can stand, 'cause I can't stand no more. Give me that pea shooter.
There's some now rather embarrassing but interesting cartoons that were made as we went to war. Embarrassing because they featured what we consider today pretty horrendous stereotypes. At the time, we were simply disenfranchising the enemy, getting rid of Hitler or a battleship full of Japanese sailors, demonizing the enemy. But Popeye became a war hero.
While Popeye was off fighting for freedom against the Axis enemies, Max and Dave Fleischer found themselves at odds with Paramount over the control of their animation studio. In the end, they lost their battle, and Paramount took over their company. Renamed Famous Studios, many of the same animators would continue to produce Popeye cartoons, but the loss of the Fleischer touch was evident.
When Famous Studios took over and they brought the operation back to New York City, the cartoons changed in a few ways. One was they went to color full-time, beautiful Technicolor. During the 1940s, the production values remained pretty high. The gag sense and the story sense sort of fell into a little bit of a rut.
Now be a nice pooch and give Popeye a smooch.
I think as Famous Studios took over the Popeye cartoons, they started to become blander. They already had started to become more streamlined, in the war years, and then the post-war years, they started to become suburban, Olive Oil's living in a suburban house. They're not in the city anymore. The animation is very smooth, but it's not very exciting a lot of the time. Even though it's many of the same artists, just somehow the edge was taken off of it, and so the stuff just became a little smoother and a little less interesting.
For a while, the guys were really trying to maintain the quality, but as budgets get cut and staff gets cut, although they still had to turn out the same amount of cartoons, as in all of the studio cartoons, even Disney, by the mid-50s, everybody was either closing their shop or thinking very seriously about closing their shop. And the Famous Studio by that time fell into that.
In August 1957, an era came to a close. After a quarter century of delighting movie theater audiences, the curtain call was announced and Popeye's film career was over. But just as he and Olive were about to sail off into the sunset, the rise of television would help bring the sturdy sailor directly into the homes of a new generation.
Popeye had been a big star for Paramount for 2 decades, 3 decades. They knew that those cartoons were a little more special than the other cartoons they had produced during that time. So they held all the Popeye cartoons separately.
The original contract that Max signed with King Features said that after 10 years after the last Popeye cartoon in the contract was made, Max Fleischer and Paramount were supposed to agree to destroy all negatives, all prints, and so forth. Well, in 1941, somebody said, hey, wait a minute, they saw television coming, because television was already introduced at the New York World's Fair in the 30s. So they thought, well, it's going to come in after the war, so we better not destroy all these films. They may come in handy.
Paramount sold them to the biggest TV distributor at the time, which was Associated Artists Productions, AAP. And Popeye became almost an overnight sensation in 1958-59 when they finally put them back on TV.
Most cities of any size at that time, well, there was something they finally referred to as an uncle show. And it would be the local weatherman or some host who would do a kids show, and usually in the afternoon after school, 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And in our town, it was Popeye's Playhouse with Skipper Chuck.
That was the local host phenomenon, you know, like Tom Hatton in Los Angeles. And they were all pretty top rating winners in those days.
Every day from 6 to 6:30, I would sit in front of the TV watching Channel 9 in Detroit, Michigan, watching Captain Jolly introduce 3 Popeye cartoons every day, 7 days a week. And I don't think I budged from that TV for about 5 years.
In this last black and white adventure, I want you to meet one of my very favorite supporting characters.
I first saw Popeye on Channel 5, KTLA Los Angeles, every afternoon, Monday through Friday, when Tom Hatton would show Popeye cartoons and teach kids how to draw Popeye in between them. And I would sit there with my little pad, and I learned how to draw Popeye just like Tom Hatton, and I still draw Popeye pretty much the same way today.
We had to have a gimmick, and so they said, what would yours be? And I said, well, I can sketch a little bit. So they said, fine. And then we decided to have kids on the show, and each kid got his own sketch pad. And of course, the cartoons are the star. Those Fleischer Brothers cartoons are so wonderful.
Package for Mr. Popeye. Sign here.
It was a new lease on life. Suddenly, the kids wanted Popeye toys. The kids really, really loved Popeye. And there hadn't been a Popeye mania like this since the 30s, really. It was outrageous. Suddenly there was a lot of new merchandise. King Features, who owned the rights to the character of Popeye, the comic strip, said, holy moly, we need to cash in on this. They commissioned a whole series of new 5-minute Popeye cartoons for television, and they distributed those in 1960, 1961.
Because of the sophisticated approach and quality of production, it took both the Fleischers and Famous Studios 25 years to make 231 Popeye cartoons. King Features took on the impossible task of producing nearly the same number in less than 2 years.
The King Features cartoons that they made for TV in the early 60s really are what you would call limited animation. They really didn't spend a lot of money on them. They farmed them out to a variety of studios. Some were done by Larry Harmon, who did Bozo the Clown. Some were done by ex-Disney guys like Jack Kinney. So the styles ranged even within that series.
Some of them are done by the old Paramount Studio people. Some of them are done by Gene Deitch in Czechoslovakia.
I don't think they ever were quite, Gene and my father were quite satisfied with the Popeyes. They never quite looked as good as some of the real classic Popeyes. The budgets were really tiny, which is why they went to Prague in the first place.
The animation didn't have the fluidity and the believability and the charm that the original Fleischer cartoons did.
They stylized down the characters, which is okay. I actually used to watch the cartoons to figure out what not to do, how not to time, how not to handle the different levels of cells. Don't cut that corner because it's going to be too obvious, because the corners they cut were unbelievable.
They had the same voices. They had, you know, Jack Mercer and Mae Questel and Jackson Beck. But it's just a question of economics, you know, when you don't have enough money to spend to make it look and sound right, you know, those are the results. And those were done very, very quickly.
What I do find interesting, though, is that there are some Seagar fans who actually get more out of them than they do the Fleischer or Famous films, because they like the fact that more of the characters from the newspaper strip can be seen in these. You get the Sea Hag, for example, who you wouldn't see in a Fleischer cartoon. And they're a slower narrative, which again, I guess is more in keeping with Seagar. So they do have their fans, it's just that I'm not among them.
But they turned out a lot of them, and they fulfilled their purpose, I guess, and they did introduce another generation of kids to Popeye.
It's a real mixed bag, those TV Popeye cartoons, but you couldn't turn on a TV without seeing Popeye in the 1960s. He was huge during that decade.
By the early 70s, Popeye found himself syndicated in various forms all across the globe, although by far his most impressive performances remain the early black and white gems. And by the end of the decade, he would return yet again with a brand new series and new look, this time produced by the renowned animation giant Hanna-Barbera. The only remaining constant of this period was Jack Mercer, who gave voice to Popeye until his death in 1984.
Their quality of animation was much better. They tried very hard, I think, to try and keep the character design correct and work the characters well. But it was Saturday morning television, and because of that, the shows didn't really carry the punch, so to speak.
When being politically correct came in the 70s and 75 and 80s, CBS laid the law down that Popeye and Bluto could not just fight each other as vigorously as they had done in the past, and they couldn't fight over olive oil because that was demeaning to women. So fighting over olive oil was taboo.
I was working for Hanna-Barbera when they produced the Popeye cartoons, and a very nice man named Lars Born was the story editor. He kept asking me to write for Popeye, but reminding me that Popeye couldn't punch people in the face and Popeye couldn't break a lot of walls and things like that, and I couldn't see what the point of it was, and I don't think Lars could either.
The success of turning comic strips into films had always been inconsistent. But with Warner Brothers' achievement in 1978's Superman the movie, every studio in town raced to the inkwell looking for great material to dramatize. Nearly 50 years after his celluloid debut, Popeye found himself returned to cinema screens, this time as the unlikely star of a big-budgeted musical extravaganza.
At the time, expectations were pretty high, and wondering what this was going to be about, and being a musical on top of it.
The movie was the debut film of rising comedian Robin Williams as the muscle-bound sailor, and Shelley Duvall was a picture-perfect incarnation of olive oil. Producer Robert Evans hired Robert Altman to direct the film. Altman, whose approach to the character would be typical Altman and atypical Popeye, collaborated with famed writer Jules Feiffer on the screenplay.
I said, which Popeye do you want, Seagars or Paramounts? He says, any Popeye you want to write, I want to make. So I figured how to tell the story, but I wanted very much to keep it in Seagar's style and Seagar's approach and Seagar's dialogue. Altman, as the film was shot, veered more and more toward the Fleischer end of it because he liked that kind of broad animated feeling. So the film is somewhere a mix between the two.
There were people thinking maybe this wasn't the little Popeye cartoon movie that they were hoping it to be. I don't know what the studios were expecting, but when you hired Robert Altman, you kind of knew that you were going to get what he was going to give you. And if you were expecting something different, maybe you shouldn't have hired him to do that.
It's always a gamble with a comic strip character. It's actually hard to make one of them a success because every person who read the strip has another picture. Of course, it got a mixed reaction, generally perceived to have not done very well, but the truth is it actually made money. It's just, I don't know, the industry was expecting something different or something.
Popeye's film career had come to an end again. However, Popeye cartoons continued to be rerun throughout the early 80s. Eventually, Popeye married Olive Oyl and started a family in the new series Popeye and Son. He also remained popular in comic books and newspaper strips, many of which were written and drawn by the hand of Seagar's only assistant, Bud Sagendorf.
The creator's assistant, Seagar, he was his assistant as a 14-year-old, and he took over the strip eventually.
Seagar taught him how to draw as close to his style as possible.
Sagendorf managed to take the Seagar Popeye of the strips and the Fleischer/Paramount Popeye of the cartoons and kind of merge them together into something that worked in both venues.
Sagendorf wrote and illustrated many of Popeye's most celebrated stories for over 3 decades, until his death in 1994. Over the years, each succeeding cartoonist has added his own touch to the character, while remaining authentic to the spirit of Seagar's original.
The design hasn't changed a whole bunch. It's been tweaked, it's been streamlined from comics to animation to print and stuff like that. But the basic shapes are still the same. I mean, it's still a little pea head with a stalk of a body and very short legs. I do try and stay true to what Seagar created and what the Fleischers perfected because I like that, because that looks correct to me.
Like Charlie Chaplin or the Three Stooges, Popeye was a movie star who never lost his audience, despite the fact that he wasn't making any new animated adventures. This was partly because of television syndication, but also because merchandising never let audiences forget that Popeye was an American icon.
Comic strips have always been a big springboard for other things, and Popeye has been one of the longest-running characters like that for licensing that I've ever seen.
He's been very successful in the world of endorsements. In the licensing world, you want to invest in a character that you know has staying power. And someone that's stayed around for about 70 years he's got a pretty good track record with the people.
In 2004, King Features celebrated Popeye's 75th anniversary with a return to television in a new animated feature film. Popeye's Voyage, The Quest for Pappy, was set in a 3D world. It was a visual style reminiscent of the Fleischer era, and it certainly created a daring new look.
And I was a little nervous about taking a classic character and trying to translate him into 3D. We reached back to the early Fleischer saying, why don't we start at the beginning and really try to pop him out and make him look like the classic animation that introduced Popeye. As an artist, if you don't allow the character to grow, we would have never left the Seagar days. It would have stayed pretty much as a strip, and that would have been that. We would have never grown into the Fleischers, which never would have grown to the Paramount, and so on.
I think the reason people still love Popeye is he still represents the common man. He represents the underdog.
Maybe it's got something to do with the fact that people like the idea of somebody who can fight back, who can stand up for himself, who's there for what's right. He's a little man as hero for the ages.
You just wonder how many cartoons that are being created today will be around 70 years from now. I don't know. How many actors from the 30s could we name? Yet you say, well, blow me down, or who eats spinach, and everybody knows it's Popeye.
With a changing American culture, the comics and cartoons need to reflect what is happening in today's world. And I think that there's always going to be a place for Popeye. There's always going to be a place for a guy with super strength who wants to do good, who's uncorruptible, who's in love and is willing to fight for the woman he loves. Popeye will endure no matter what the new generations bring.
Since Popeye sneaked into the pages of Thimble Theater back in 1929, he has remained one of the most beloved heroes our country has ever produced. Whether it be the Depression, a world war, decades of heartbreak over the same woman, or even the entertainment industry itself, Popeye has stood tall and proud throughout it all, never wavering, never forgetting his humble roots, and never forgetting who he is. And just who is Popeye? He's a superstar. But if you ask him, he'll probably tell you something else.
I am what I am, and that's all what I am. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man.
Strike up the band for Popeye the Sailor, cash in his hand. Ride off a whale, stand in a row. No! Don't let him go. No! He's a cinch, but every inch a sailor.
Strike up the band for Popeye the Sailor, cash in his hand. Ride off a whaler, stand in a row.
No!
Don't let him go.
No!
He's a cinch, but every inch a sailor.
No!
Yuck, 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 yuck.